Good afternoon. Nice to see you all here. Welcome back to the Ground Zero Cafe. I'm Vanessa Gomez-Brake, the Associate Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life. So this speaker series represents a creative solution to an important problem in this university setting. It's that separation of the intellectual life from the personal and the spiritual. What matters to me and why? This offers the Trojan family an opportunity to hear from USC faculty, administrators, staff in a very different way. Rather than lecturing on their area of expertise or research, though that might be a part of it, we intentionally invite speakers to share their life journey with us. So once a month on this Wednesday afternoon, we get to have lunch together. We listen in as they reflect on their values, their beliefs, and their motivations that have shaped their lives. So, if you would like to nominate a member of the USC community to speak at a future event, please visit our website. That's orsl.usc.edu. And additionally, you can visit our website to view recordings of many of our past speakers. Before we begin our main program, I'd like to highlight just a few upcoming events this semester that I'd love to see you show up for. The first is hosted by the Ansar Service Partnership, presenting Fastathon. So the idea is that you will fast for a day in order that someone else may be able to eat. So on November 13th, plan to fast that day and break your fast with fellow students and staff here at USC over at the TCC Ballroom at 5 p.m. By giving up a meal, you get to give a meal. Additionally, this is interesting. Some of you may know I'm a university point person on DACA, so I support our undocumented students here on campus. And next week, the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life will be sponsoring DACA, the day after the Supreme Court hearing. So again, you can have lunch with me on a Wednesday, but we'll be over at the University Religious Center at 12 o'clock, and you'll get to hear from the experts. So those are the co-directors of our immigration clinic at Gould, that's Jean Reese, and as well as legal representatives and some of our own DACA-mentored students here at USC. Lastly, I'll just mention this event is the third of 4 What Matters to Me and Why speaking events this semester, and I hope you'll come back in December because we have Karen Thompson, who will be here on December 4th. She is an associate professor of English, Gender and Sexuality Studies, and American Studies and Ethnicity. She's written some pretty amazing books, and she's also a Filipina like me. So I'm excited to hear her life journey. All right, that's it for my announcements. So grab a sandwich if you haven't already, sit back and relax, as well as be prepared to ask a question of our speaker. After today's event, we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for you to ask a question. Just be sure to raise your hand. That way the microphone can get to you and everyone can hear your question. All right. In order to introduce today's speaker, I've asked Tricia Tucker here to tell us a bit about Michael Bunn. Tricia is an assistant professor of writing and a faculty and resident at the McCarthy Honors College. So please help me in welcoming Professor Tucker to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Let's see. Mike is a lot taller than me, so I will push this up a little bit. Okay. Thank you so much for coming out. It's wonderful to see so many people here and from a wide variety of communities here at USC. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you today my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Bunn from the Writing Program here at USC. Mike is an associate professor of writing. He's been here for quite a while, and in that time, he has assembled quite a community of students who view him as a really meaningful mentor and also often a friend. If you talk to his students or check out his Rate My Professor page, you'll see that the most frequently used words to describe him are awesome and cool and kind and caring. And then the one you'll probably see more than anything is funny. And I think that that's, for any friends of Mike, we know that he's a really funny, irreverent, iconoclastic kind of guy. Of course, he has all the necessary credentials you would expect a professor like him to have, a Ph.D. in English and Education from the University of Michigan. He has an M.F.A. in creative writing from the University of Pittsburgh. But I feel like his credentials don't really speak to everything about him that makes him so interesting. Mike, I remember the first faculty meeting I went to with him. I didn't know him well. I saw a guy at the meeting not wearing shoes, and I thought, who is this strange fellow who is my colleague and is willing to not wear shoes when he wants to? And I found out that that was just one of the things about him. He's not afraid to be himself, and that makes him a really interesting person to talk to and a really meaningful person for students to get to know and to learn from. He's designed a couple really cool classes in the writing program that I like to talk about. One is a writing and sustainability class that really appeals to students who care about environmental issues, and shouldn't we all? And he also teaches a 440, I think that's the most advanced type of class that the writing program offers, on comedy writing. And again, in this day and age, I think he has a lot to offer us in terms of thinking about the ways that comedy can be useful social critique. So anyway, I think he's an inspirational friend and colleague. I admit I have no idea what he's going to talk about today, and that's one of the things I also love about him. He's very surprising. And if you ever have a chance to karaoke with him, I would highly recommend it. So today I'm pleased to present to you, or introduce to you, my colleague, Dr. Mike Bunn.
Whoa, that's bright. Hi. First, I'd like to fix this. Hi. First, thank you, everybody, for coming out, and also thank you for the opportunity to share some of my ideas today. In my first class this morning, some of my students asked, "Are you nervous?" I am now. Thank you. Part of that is because earlier this semester, for my Writing 150 classes that I'm teaching, I essentially assigned this assignment to my students. Their first task was, what matters to you and why? And so I'm picturing a number of them here today who I can see through this misty fog with the Writing 150 rubric assessing me rather harshly. That said, there were a range of pretty interesting things that people talked about, everything from climate change to family members. There was one student, when I've done this before, who wrote an incredibly persuasive essay about her meaningful relationship with cheese. So I've thought a fair amount about what I wanted to talk about. And one of the things we talked about in class is the benefit of focusing in on one thing, one major thing. And I thought a lot about talking about the idea of narrative and storytelling. I actually gave a talk that Tricia invited me to do last year about storytelling. I met my wife in a short story workshop. It's adorable. My daughter's first name is Story. It's even more adorable. Then I thought about and even had outlined half of a talk about the value of in-person conversation and how most of the things that I've learned in my life are a result of conversations that I've had with people. Often me saying something pretty stupid and them calling me on it. But the truth is that as I thought and came back again and again about what I wanted to focus on, I kept returning to a single thing, and it was a document that I was sent out as a USC faculty member. And the document was the highlights from the 2019 AAU Campus Climate Survey on Sexual Assault and Sexual Misconduct. And so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try to focus in on one thing that does matter to me tremendously, and I'm going to try to talk about it today in the way that I might encourage my students to address something in an essay. So this is my version of what matters to me and why, similar to the form of an essay, all right? And the first thing that we talk about in class is generating interest, right? You might think in terms of an opening hook, right? Some way to generate interest. So here's what I've got. It's dangerous to be a student at USC or to be a student at most of the colleges in the United States of America. Now, that's a bold claim. That's pretty quiet in here right now. But this is actually something that I believe. And I want to work to explain that a little bit more and to support some of those ideas. So this is where I'm going to bring in some of that background information and some of those statistics. Now, according to that survey that I just mentioned, 8,381 students responded to that survey, and 20.5% of the undergraduate responders experienced some form of sexual assault while at USC. That includes over 10% of undergraduate men, right? Roughly 1 in 5 total. In doing research for this talk, I found someone who is writing about sexual assault and sexual rape across college campuses and was comparing it to a recent spat of stories about a crime wave in Detroit, or a perceived crime wave. And he said the rates of sexual assault across college campuses are 400 times the rates of sexual assault on campus. Now, one of the things that many people who think about this issue know is that these rates are notoriously difficult to discern, in large part because many of the survivors, people who've suffered from sexual assault and so on, do not step forward. But that 1 in 5 statistic gets promoted and gets sort of talked about a lot. And what I want to suggest is, does it matter? Does it matter if it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 7 or 1 in 8? Is anybody suggesting it's not high enough? Is anybody going to make the case that it's not an absolute travesty at the rates that it is? And I want to stop and take a moment right now and make clear that if I've tried to be pretty careful and thoughtful about how I want to talk about this today, but if for any reason at any point anyone would like to step out of the room, that's no problem whatsoever. This is the point where if I'm writing the essay, I'm going to bring in some quotes. I'm bringing some relatively famous people to help establish why I think this is such a pressing problem. And this is a quote from the author Daisy Whitney referring to her rape. "It's already bigger than everything else. It lives in front of me, behind me, next to me, inside me every single day. My schedule is dictated by it, my habits by it, my music." That same campus survey listed a number of potential effects on students. Feelings of helplessness, feeling numb or detached, withdrawing from social interactions, difficulty concentrating on coursework, missing classes and dropping out. Lady Gaga, you've probably heard of her. I don't know if she's still involved with Bradley Cooper or not, but she says this: "When you go through a trauma like that, it doesn't just have the immediate physical ramifications on you. For many people, it has almost like trauma, where you really experience it through the years after it. It can trigger patterns in your body of physical distress." And one of the things that we've talked about with this essay and with this in my class is, why does this matter to you? There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of things that are important, but why does it matter to you? And the truth is, I am not a survivor of sexual assault. I have not gone through this myself. But my wife has, and I asked her permission to share that with you. And one of the reasons I care so much about this is because I remember the first time I ever put my hand on her wrist. She was sitting on a sofa in her apartment, and I reached to help pick her up. And the way that she flinched and the cringe that crossed her face is something I'm never going to forget. And I care about this issue because probably once a year, I have a student in my office hours talking to me, trying to piece his or her life back together, including one of my favorite students, and sorry, we do have favorite students, who disappeared for 3 weeks last year, who only reemerged because I emailed her every other day because I sensed that something had happened. I care about this issue because it's messed up, and we know it's messed up, and we're not doing more about it. And I care about this issue because this school talks a lot about the Trojan family, and so do my students, and I know that it matters to you. When I ask my students why they picked USC, the idea of the Trojan family comes up. It's something that people believe in, and I love that. And I think it's something that we can do better. One of the things that we talk about with that assignment is that you're not setting out to solve something, right? I'm not going to solve sexual assault at USC or anywhere else in a 20, 30-minute talk, any more than a student's going to solve climate change or homelessness in a 5 or 6 page essay. But what I suggest to them, and what I want to suggest to everybody here today, or anybody in the future who might watch this online, is that you can do things to improve it. There are people at USC who are incredibly dedicated to dealing with this issue. And I want to acknowledge that. And I've had the opportunity to work with some of them, including 3 years ago, where I went with some other people to various fraternities to talk about what consent is, what consent means. But the truth is, it's not enough. It's not even close to enough, given what we know is happening. Now, you may feel also, and I think this is reasonable, this is not what you signed up for today, right? I was introduced very much in a way that I appreciate as the funny professor, and this is not funny, right? You may wonder, is this an appropriate venue to even talk about this? And what I want to suggest to you is that every venue is the appropriate venue to talk about this until it changes. I debated this a lot. My wife knows this. I was ready to bail on this topic as recently as last week, right? I am a cisgendered, white, heterosexual, married, American, I mean, all the types of privilege. I've already said that I am not a victim or survivor of sexual assault, right? Who am I to talk about this right now? And then I found this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. while I was doing research. Said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And that pretty much sealed it for me. Everybody in here can do more than you're doing. For those of you who are students, that might be raising awareness. That might be participating in some form as a bystander. That same survey that I referred to earlier suggested that 23.8% of undergraduates and 4.4% of graduate professional students witnessed an event that could have led to sexual assault. And this report was happy to promote, and I was very glad about this, that the overwhelming majority of people, of those people, 75% of undergrads, 66% of graduate professional students, reported taking some course of action that USC recorded as upstanding. Whether that was intervening in the situation, checking on the students, confronting the perpetrator, reporting to the school, something. You know, when I went to those fraternities a couple years ago, there was one house that had developed something that I thought was kind of interesting. And I don't say this to promote this particular measure, but to show it as an example of what students themselves had decided to try to do. In this particular fraternity, they had a code word. They didn't tell me what it was, why would they? But they had a code word. And if they saw one of their brothers in a situation that seemed precarious, dubious, for any reason, another brother could walk up, say this code word, and they both simply walked away. They walked away from the situation, no questions asked, and they talked about it a day or two later. Again, I'm not suggesting that that's the way to approach it, but it was students proactively trying to do something. For my colleagues who are faculty, you may very reasonably say, this is not in my job description. But I find it hard to believe that if you were sitting in your class and a fire broke out, that you would simply leave the students in there to burn. There are things that you can do, and it does not have to be consulting students one-on-one in office hours. That may not feel like you or something you're comfortable with. But are there things that you can do? One thing that I do as an example in my class, in fact, we're going to do this in one of my classes on Friday, is I often assign an opinion column as a particular type of writing. I think it's a very interesting type of writing for students to use. And one of the essays that I assign as a model text, one for us to look and talk about, is an essay by a woman named Emily Yolf. And she has a very controversial and debatable position. She says that we're infantilizing women if we don't let them know that they put themselves at danger of sexual assault when they're drinking. And my students react very strongly to that, and I expect that on Friday, right? But here's the thing. It is completely suitable as an assignment. It follows the conventions of a genre of opinion column, and we talk about that. and it takes a legitimately debatable stance. And we talk about that too. But I'm also completely upfront with my students, and I will be on Friday as well, that part of the reason that I'm bringing that in is to have an occasion to talk about what's happening on campuses, including this one. One of the ways that I often end that class session is to read the definition, both USC's and the state of California, about what consent is. And that's something that I think faculty can do. I know that a number of us in the writing program include a tremendous amount of information at the bottom of our syllabus about campus resources, counseling, so on. I am thinking about this talk, I'm gonna start putting on what the definition of consent is. Because one of the things that I found going to those fraternities and talking with students, it's very ambiguous for a lot of people. Does someone have to verbally say yes? Do you have to check in again and again? There's some uncertainty there. What I wanna suggest is that faculty can do more. And the institution can do more. On October 17th, we had across the campus the mandatory Great Shakeout, right, dealing with earthquake. Now, I realize that may be state mandated. I don't know a lot about the background of that. But since I've been here almost 10 years, there's been no major earthquake. But there has been a lot of sexual assault on campus. Where's the equivalent? Several years back, there was a tragedy on campus, a legitimate tragedy, in which student was killed. And USC responded by starting to change the nature of campus. They put up fences at night. They check IDs. Where is the equivalent response for what basically everyone knows is happening? The author Jill Tolentino points out in a recent article addressing campus rape culture how many schools are still behind on this. She writes, the recent shift in the broader social understanding of sexual assault has been so dramatic and so overdue that it has obscured the fact that our systems still mostly fail on this particular topic. She also talks about how difficult it is a topic to write about because we're used to writing, especially for reporters, about things that are sensational, that are particular. And she says, I've begun to think that there's no room for writing about sexual assault that relies on any sense of anomaly, any sense of that it's a particular or special occasion. The truth about rape is that it's not exceptional. It's not anomalous. And there's no way to make that into a satisfying story. I think part of what she's getting at is it's difficult to write about things and to make people care about things when they know it's happening. We know, most of us, that the world's getting warmer and we're experiencing climate change, and there's debates about what to do about it and the causes. Most of us know that a few miles from here is one of, if not the largest homeless encampment in the country. I don't think for one second that I'm introducing most of you to the fact that this is a problem. I think the far more interesting thing is to think about when there's a problem, why is it still happening? And if I'll digress for just a second, one of the best written essays I ever read from a student, it was a draft. And she came into my office hours and I could tell she was proud of this draft. And man, it was well researched. It was written in an engaging style for a general audience. And she wrote one of the most persuasive essays I'd ever read, that drunk driving is bad. And I looked at her after talking to her draft, and I said to her, as kindly as I could, does anybody think drunk driving is good? And I watched her understand. Nobody needs a paper that drunk driving's bad. We all know we're not supposed to do it. What we need, and what she eventually wrote, to her tremendous credit and the effort she put in, was an essay trying to articulate why it still happens. What I want to suggest to you, everybody here, and myself included, is that part of why campus sexual assault still happens is because we let it continue to happen. So I'm calling out everyone in this room and anyone who might watch this later. Think about what you might do to address this situation and make it a little bit better. This talk was my attempt to try to do that. And it's not going to be my last one. Thank you. Got a little bit of time left. I can try to be funny if it helps. Are there any questions? Can also let that just sit for a minute. Can I ask, I bring the microphone down, is that right? Just about like.
So I'm an advisor, and I know that students do something like think about it, all these modules. Have you ever had a chance of looking at those?
Could you say a little bit more about what they are, especially because I know that there's a lot of students here who may not know what they are?
Incoming freshmen and incoming grad students need to take online modules for awareness, for consent, and all these things. And
Yeah.
They're called like think about it and do this. Have you ever had a chance to see the questions and see if they're
Yeah, I
addressing?
haven't. Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for breaking the silence. I haven't had a chance to look at those. I know that for faculty such as myself, we have a 2-hour version. It's either every year or every other year around sort of sexual harassment and those practices, but I haven't had a chance to look at the specific ones. Can I ask, is there a particular thing about those that you think is useful or that could be improved? Or I'm sort of wondering what you're thinking about those.
Well, as a staff, I don't get to see them either, so I wonder what they're getting out of them. And just like you said, with our harassment training every 2 years, they
Yeah.
are getting better and they're getting more tailored. So
Yeah.
I would think that the undergrad and grad version is doing that as well, but it would be nice to have access to seeing the questions and the scenarios and how they portray it.
Yeah, I've sort of, like I said, I wasn't kidding when I said that I waffled a lot about this talk. And I've sort of imagined what I might get in terms of Q&A. And I think one of the reasonable questions is a little bit different than we're asking. Is like, okay, buddy, what do you want us to do about it? Right? And I've run through a zillion things, right? I've run through everything from like, have a talk with a friend to like, what if the Daily Trojan for a month only published articles on this? Or what if our new provost and president decided that this was one of, and I haven't had the occasion to meet either of them, this may be very important to them, but what if this were determined or as one of, if not the major priority of USC? I haven't had a chance to look at those. And I do want to reiterate something that I said earlier, which is I know that there are people who care a lot about this, and there are people who are working on this campus and others all over the country to try to make it better. I'm just suggesting it's not enough, and that we can't leave it to a handful of people to try to address something that is affecting potentially 20% of our population. Sorry, it's really hard to see.
Hi. I found this very interesting kind of, I think, analogy that when you mentioned there was some serious tragedy a few years ago, and then it was responded to by increasing kind of policing, right? And again, you're saying there is this problem, and let's police more. So is there other way of maybe tackling it, also? And maybe there should be a hybrid approach to it,
Yeah.
so that, there are opportunities for, what I mean, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're raising a good point, which was the response to the student death that I mentioned a few years ago was lauded and praised by some and very much criticized by other people in terms of the closing of campus and part of what USC potentially offered to the rest of LA and the surrounding community. Not only would I say that a hybrid response would be valuable, it has to involve those of you who are students here. It has to involve those of you who are faculty. It has to involve the administration. I spent time unsuccessfully figuring out the definition of an epidemic. An epidemic, right? A disease that is so pronounced in its severity that it requires tremendous action. Technically, sexual assault on college campuses doesn't fall into that, but come on, really? We're talking about 1 in 5 people It's basically an epidemic. I mean, that is a huge issue. And so how do you reduce it? How do you address it? I think you're absolutely right. I think it would have to take interventions at all different kinds of levels. And I think, again, what I want to suggest is a huge part of the challenge is that we know that it's a feature of our campus and campuses everywhere. And we almost, and again, not everybody, I'm hesitant to generalize, but is this a given the way that tuition rates going up are? Like, are we gonna put those parallel, that that's just a part of college? You know, unfortunately, one of the people who was most vocal about this, and I think his credibility is very shot now because people step forward, but then Vice President Joe Biden was one of the people who's like, are you kidding? And if the rates were reversed, where it was men who were primarily being the victims and survivor, would this be looked at different? I don't want to misquote, but at one point he was like, would parents actually drop their kids off if when they showed up on the first day, they knew that 1 out of 5 of them was going to be harmed? Right? I don't like talking about this. I like talking about storytelling. And if anybody wants to talk with me about that on another occasion, I would be happy to. But the numbers are staggering. And I know firsthand what it can do to people. And so what I think has to happen, I very much think it needs to be a broad-based concerted effort. I don't have an answer, but I know there's a lot of incredibly smart, thoughtful, engaged people at this university who at all different levels could try to help.
I was actually kind of returning to the first question. I'm so glad you brought up that mandatory training component that's already part of every student's initiation into the USC culture. But as a fellow faculty member, I have no idea what that is like, but we do have some students in the room, and I was wondering if they might be willing to share, if it's not putting them on the spot too much, there any impressions they had of that training, if they found it meaningful, or if they had any suggestions for improvement. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? That consent training? We have no idea what it looks like, what it's like for you guys.
Several of my students are slinking down in their chair, going, don't call on me, don't call on me.
Yeah, I don't know if it's changed much since I took it because it's my 5th year now and I took it as a freshman. My impression of the training was it had a lot of good information, but it was really lengthy, and I feel like a lot of students kind of just go through it, press all the buttons just to get through it, rather than like trying to learn and retain all the information. And I think it's also required for students to go through it before they're able to register for classes, so I feel like a lot of students kind of just see it as an obstacle to get through rather than important information to take in. So I think while it has good information, there needs to be a more engaging way for students to be able to learn information and kind of acknowledge that, well, obviously everyone knows that this is an important issue, but I don't know, the way that it's set up, it's kind of just a hurdle for students to get through. So maybe more engaging events or activities or something like that.
So I didn't really feel like the questions dove into enough of the ambiguous circumstances that sometimes play into instances of sexual assault. Like, it's not always, I don't have any numbers to back this up, but there are some cases where I don't think it's strictly like a malicious, violent intent from one party, but it can still have really negative repercussions. And I don't think the questions like addressed that possibility.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that, and Sam, yeah, I know Sam, tell me if this doesn't address what you're wondering about, but, one of the things that didn't surprise me how often it came up, but surprised me with maybe the level of concern or fear was I did have the opportunity to go, and I volunteered, I wanted this opportunity, to go with another colleague to speak with some of the fraternity members, sort of in a required house event about consent. And we talked about different things. And, you know, a certain number of people had to be there, and there were certainly people who were checked out, but a lot of the students were incredibly engaged and brought up some of this same point, right? The idea of like, well, where is that line crossed, and what if we're both drinking? And the very much the concern of false accusations, right? This sort of concern of, oh, he or she is going to regret it later, and then sort of retaliate. And it is a huge gray area. It's a huge gray area. It's one of the reasons that I think making efforts to talk about what consent is so very important. But one of the articles that I was reading was talking about how, you know, with a DUI, you blow a certain number. You're either too drunk to drive or you're not, right? What is there a clear equivalent line with regard to sexual assault? I have no doubt that there is often mistakes made, and often a sense amongst the two parties that the thing went down very differently. What I would suggest is, one, you're absolutely right, and two, it helps. I think it makes the case even more urgent to do more about it, right? Because it is so confusing for a lot of people, and how someone can be involved in one sort of situation and think that something else was transpiring. You know, I mean, the other reality, you know, and this is just a reality, is that alcohol and drugs are involved in a huge percentage, right? Which complicates things even more when you're thinking about willing consent and people having misunderstandings about the situation and so on. So you're absolutely right. It's an incredibly fraught situation. You know, what I would say is, regardless of how it's happening, we do know that it's happening. And no, going back to your point, sir, no one thing is going to fix this, right? Passing out flyers for a month is not going to change this, right? I don't know what would fix it or improve it, is a better way to put it. But I feel pretty strongly we should try.
Hey, Michael, it's Vanessa. I'm curious. You teach your students to be persuasive writers, right? And you have them choosing these topics that are meaningful to them. And then today, you use this space to speak to a very important issue, something that's very important to our campus, our Trojan family, as well as to our society. And I guess the question I have is, as you're teaching and even in your own experience, how do you find that confidence to give voice? Because I imagine a lot of our students may not feel confident to speak up in such a way. They don't always have a pulpit or a podium like a faculty and administrators have. And how do you find, like, it sounded like you even struggled, right, to determine whether you were going to speak on this topic today or not. So where does that confidence come from to speak on an issue that may not even be something that you've experienced?
I don't think there's any one place that it can come from people, right? One of the things that I talk to students about is that, and came up today in class, is that if you care about something, there's a far better likelihood that it's going to mean something for you to write about it or talk about it, and a better chance that it's going to get conveyed in a way that's interesting or compelling to people. But in answer to your question more directly, it's easy. My wife said, say what you think you need to say. And I did not want to give this talk. I was in the bathroom a few minutes ago beforehand going like, can I just kick it in here till 1? All right. I questioned whether it's appropriate for me to give this talk. I questioned whether this is an appropriate venue. And it didn't hurt when you come across a pretty compelling quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that seems to support what you're trying to do. But I don't think there is one way, you know? I just think that in this occasion in particular, I had the opportunity. And I did look at the email you sent me, and the very last thing was, there were some outlines of ideas, and the very last one said, feel free, though, to some version like, feel free to talk about whatever you want. I was like, okay, done. So, but yeah, I did go back and forth on this, and I just think that it does become easier if it's something that you care about, but also if it's something that you're realistic, right? I don't think I mean, if so, great. I hope I'm opening somebody's eyes, but I think most of you probably know that this is a problem on campus. I don't think we're gonna walk out of here and by 9 p.m. tonight have it fixed. You know, I hope that I have realistic expectations about why I'm doing what I'm doing. But, I've thought about this. I love writing, and I love teaching writing. I really do. Some of the students are like, but I do. But I would trade helping 1,000 students learn to write better if I could find a way to have one person avoid all that goes with sexual assault. And so at a certain point, it just felt like I had to talk about this. Sam again.
Do you think that it would sound like victim blaming to say that women would be safer if they were taught to be more assertive in what they want and don't want at a young age?
I want to make sure that I have the question right. Will you repeat it again, but repeat it a little bit louder, Sam?
Do you think that women would be safer if they were taught to be more assertive in what they want and don't want, especially in circumstances that are around sexual assault, like drinking and stuff on college campuses?
I don't know that I mean, the easy answer for you and several of the people in the room is we're going to talk about this on Friday when we do look at that opinion column. But I think it's a really debatable point, right? I think some people, and so I'm dodging your question to a degree only because I don't have an answer. I don't feel definitively one way. This is an issue where I understand multiple sides. There's some people who say, look, we're doing, including Emily Yoff, who I referenced, who says, we're doing young women a disservice. If we're in the name of feminism or some other thing, not making the case to them, the reality is they put themselves in danger if they're drinking more or doing drugs, then that's a disservice. At the same time, and she does acknowledge that it's perpetrators who are at fault and so on, but that's a tough sell, right? I think that's a tough sell, and I think both male and female students have had issues with that idea. I know, however, if I ask some of my students, will you jog downtown late at night on your own? They'll say no. I do think there's certain behaviors that unfortunately people have ingrained as certain types of risks. So I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's just one more way that this thing is very complicated. A part of what I like is putting that out there. Again, I wouldn't assign this particular column if it didn't fit the work of our course, but I also like letting students assess and think and talk with each other about what they make of that idea.
All right, Michael, on behalf of USC, thank you so much for sharing and speaking on this important issue. And I invite you all, if you want to ask him a question once he gets off the stage, you're welcome to continue to hang out and so forth. But a small gesture for your service here today in terms of documenting what truly matters to you and why. Just one more place to put down your thoughts. Thank you, Michael. Let's give him a round of applause.